Logan Riggenbaugh reporting live in the studio. Logan, thank you for that report. Following his State of the State address Wednesday night, Governor Patrick Morrisey spoke with us about his legislative priorities for the 2026 session. The governor emphasizes that the state can afford his proposed 10% income tax cut, citing the state's budget surplus of over $120 million over the first 6 months of the fiscal year. The governor says the tax cut is necessary to address affordability challenges West Virginians face with high grocery and power bills, and to stay competitive with surrounding states that have recently cut their income taxes. On Morrisey's proposed $6 million Bring Them Home fund for child welfare facilities, the governor said the investment would allow the state to begin returning dozens of foster children currently placed out of state.
If you start to invest in refurbishing some of the state facilities, we think that that's going to be positive, because when you have good facilities and then you make sure that the provider capacity is strong in that area, then you don't have to send the kids everywhere out of state.
The governor identified his top legislative priorities as the 10% income tax cut, the 3% pay raise for state workers, and reforms to the foster care system. Still ahead, Wood County Schools pre-K and kindergarten enrollment is just around the corner.